The British royal family has spent years trying to keep its private disagreements behind palace walls. But now, one relationship appears to be moving in a very different direction, and it could have consequences far beyond one father and one son. King Charles and Prince Harry have taken another step toward reconnecting, and suddenly the old family divide is back in the spotlight. After years of distance, public accusations, painful interviews, and a relationship that seemed almost impossible to repair, the possibility of Charles and Harry becoming closer again is creating a completely different picture of the royal family. And this time, the question isn't simply whether a father has forgiven his son. The bigger question is what this means for Prince William. Because while reports have described Charles's renewed contact with Harry as an olive branch, reports have also claimed that William and Catherine have had serious conversations about the situation. One recent report even described them as holding crisis talks after Harry and Meghan's reunion with the king. Now, we need to be careful here. There has been no official palace announcement saying that William is furious with his father, and there is no confirmed statement from William or Kate saying they feel betrayed. But the reports themselves reveal why this story has become so fascinating. Because for years, the royal family appeared to have drawn a line. Harry had moved to California. William had continued preparing for his future role as king. Charles had continued his duties as monarch. And the distance between the brothers seemed almost impossible to close. Then Harry came back into the picture, and suddenly the door that many people thought had been permanently closed appeared to open again. Recent coverage has focused heavily on Charles's relationship with Harry and his efforts to remain connected with Archie and Lilibet. For a father, that is understandable. For a grandfather, perhaps even more so. But inside a family where personal relationships and the future of the monarchy are constantly intertwined, nothing is ever completely simple. That is what makes Charles's approach to Harry so significant. Because William isn't just Harry's older brother. He is the heir to the throne. Every major decision involving the royal family eventually becomes part of the institution William will one day inherit. And that creates an emotional conflict that is almost impossible to ignore. Imagine being William. You have watched the relationship with your brother deteriorate. You have seen private family matters become public. You have watched Harry discuss painful memories in interviews and in his memoir. And after all of that, your father decides to reopen the door. Not necessarily to erase the past. Not necessarily to pretend nothing happened. But simply to give Harry another chance. For Charles, it may be a father's decision. For William, it could feel like something much bigger. And that is where this story becomes emotional. Because beneath all the titles, ceremonies, palaces, and public appearances, this is still a family dealing with something painfully familiar. Two brothers who once stood side by side, but now live very different lives. And Charles may have reached a point where he no longer wants to spend the rest of his life watching that distance grow. The reports of a possible reconciliation have therefore created a strange new dynamic. Harry appears closer to his father. William remains distant from Harry. And Kate is reportedly caught in the middle of a family situation that has already lasted for years. But here's the part that could change everything. What if Charles isn't trying to choose Harry over William at all? What if he is simply trying to repair one relationship before it becomes too late? That possibility changes the entire story. Because King Charles chooses Harry makes for a dramatic headline, but the reality may be far more emotional. It could be a father trying to recover lost time with his son and grandchildren. And if that's what Charles is really doing, then the next question becomes even more difficult. Can William accept his father's decision without reopening every wound between the brothers? That is the tension now hanging over the royal family. And as the reported reconciliation continues to develop, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. Harry may have finally found a door back into his father's life. But whether that same door can ever lead him back to William is a completely different question. And that is where this royal story gets even more complicated. But there is one detail that makes this situation far more complicated than a simple father-son reunion. William and Harry still appear to be far apart. Even after Harry's recent reunion with King Charles, reporting has indicated that the brothers remain estranged, with no clear sign of a private reconciliation between them. And that is where the emotional weight of Charles's decision really begins to hit. Because Harry didn't just leave the royal family, he left at a time when his relationship with William was already under enormous strain. Then came the interviews, the accusations, the memoir, and years of public discussion about what happened inside the family. For William, this wasn't simply a disagreement between two brothers that could be solved with one phone call. It became something much deeper, something that affected trust, something that affected the people closest to both men, and something that eventually became impossible to keep completely private. So when Charles opened the door to Harry again, the question wasn't whether William had the power to stop it. He didn't. Charles is the king, Harry is his son, and ultimately, a father can decide that he wants a relationship with his child, even when other members of the family aren't ready to do the same. That may be the most uncomfortable part of this entire story. William may not be ready to forgive, Kate may not be ready to forget. But Charles may have decided that waiting for everyone to agree isn't an option anymore. And there is something deeply human about that. Imagine being a father who has watched his son live thousands of miles away. Imagine knowing that your grandchildren are growing up without the ordinary family moments that other grandparents take for granted. Birthdays, Christmases, quiet conversations, simple afternoons together. Those moments don't come back. And perhaps Charles has reached the point where the past matters less than the time still available in the future. Recent reports have described Harry as determined to continue rebuilding his relationship with the royal family and especially with his father. But rebuilding trust is not the same thing as forgetting what happened. That distinction could become crucial because Charles can welcome Harry back into his life without demanding that William immediately do the same. And that may be exactly what is happening. One relationship is being repaired. Another remains broken. And the royal family now has to find a way to live with both realities at the same time. Then came the reports about William and Kate. A recent report claimed that the Prince and Princess of Wales held serious discussions following Charles's meeting with Harry and Meghan, describing the situation as a source of concern and emotional frustration. But those claims come from royal reporting and unnamed sources, not from an official statement by William or Kate. That distinction matters, because the palace has said very little, and sometimes, in the royal family, silence creates more questions than answers. If William truly wanted Harry completely out of the picture, what happens now? Does he accept his father's decision? Does he remain completely distant? Or does Charles's renewed relationship with Harry eventually force the brothers into the same room again? That possibility is what makes the future so unpredictable. Because there are already moments when their paths could cross, and every future royal gathering now carries an unanswered question. Will William and Harry finally speak? For years, the public has watched the brothers move in opposite directions. William moved deeper into royal duty. Harry moved further away from it. One prepared for the throne. The other built a new life in California. But Charles's decision may have changed the balance. Harry is no longer simply the son who left. He is once again becoming part of his father's personal world. And if that relationship continues to grow, William may eventually have to decide whether protecting the future of the monarchy means keeping Harry at a distance, or whether there is room for forgiveness after all. And there is another person whose role cannot be ignored, Catherine, Princess of Wales, because Kate has spent years supporting William through the pressures surrounding the royal family. If the reports about her concerns are accurate, then this isn't simply about Harry returning. It's about whether the wounds of the past can ever truly be closed. And that leads to perhaps the most painful question of all. What happens when one member of a family is ready to forgive, but another isn't? Because Charles may have opened the door, Harry may be willing to walk through it, but William is still standing on the other side of that family divide. And unless something changes, the king could soon find himself facing an impossible choice, not between two sons, but between two very different visions of what family reconciliation should actually look like. And the next chapter could reveal whether Charles's olive branch becomes the beginning of a royal healing or the moment that creates an even deeper divide. And now there is another layer to this story that makes the situation even more difficult for King Charles. Because Harry's return is no longer just about the past. It may also be about the future. Reports suggest Harry is determined to continue rebuilding his relationship with his family, while royal commentators have warned that Charles and William need to maintain a united approach whenever Harry returns to the UK. That warning is important, because the monarchy cannot afford to look divided at the very top. Charles is the king. William is the heir. And whatever happens between Harry and his father inevitably has the potential to affect the relationship between Charles and William. That is why some royal commentators have described the situation as potentially dangerous for the institution itself. But there is something else happening beneath the headlines. Harry appears to understand that his relationship with Charles could be the key to rebuilding some connection with the family. And that may explain why the recent meeting mattered so much. After years of separation, Charles welcomed Harry, Meghan, Archie, and Lilibet at Highgrove in July. It was a significant family moment because Charles was able to spend time with his grandchildren after a long period apart. For Harry, that moment may have meant something deeply personal. For Charles, it may have been even more emotional, because no matter how complicated the history becomes, Archie and Lilibet are still his grandchildren. And once children enter the picture, old arguments can suddenly look very different. The king may be thinking about something much simpler than royal politics. He may simply be thinking about time. How much time has already been lost? How many birthdays have passed? How many ordinary family moments will never come back? And perhaps that is why Charles seems willing to take a risk. But William's position creates another problem. Royal commentator Richard Fitzwilliams has argued that Charles and William need to speak with one voice on Harry's future visits because serious divisions between the king and heir could damage the monarchy. That means the real issue may not be whether Harry is allowed back into Charles's life. The real issue could be how far that reconciliation goes. Will Harry remain simply Charles's son? Or could he eventually become a more visible part of the wider royal family's future? That is where William's concerns become understandable, because Harry's return to the spotlight could easily overshadow William's work. Every appearance would generate questions. Every photograph would be analyzed. Every interaction between the brothers would become headline news. A handshake could become a story. A glance could become a story. And silence could become an even bigger story. For William, who has spent years trying to establish himself as the future king, that could be deeply frustrating. And for Charles, it creates a delicate balancing act. He has to be a father, but he also has to be the monarch. He has to think about Harry, but he also has to think about William. And somehow, he has to make sure that one relationship does not destroy another. Then comes the September question. Harry is expected to return to the UK for a well-child engagement, meaning the possibility of another royal family encounter is already hanging over the future. And this time, everyone will be watching. Will Charles meet Harry again? Will William avoid him? Could Kate become involved? Could there finally be a private conversation between the brothers? Nobody knows. And perhaps that uncertainty is exactly what makes this story so compelling. Because the July reunion proved something that many people thought was impossible. Charles and Harry can still sit together. They can still reconnect. They can still create new memories, but that does not automatically repair the relationship between Harry and William. That wound is different. It has a different history, and it may require something completely different to heal. Maybe an apology, maybe forgiveness, maybe simply time. But there is one thing that cannot be ignored. The longer this situation continues, the harder it becomes for the royal family to keep the two sides completely separate. Eventually, circumstances may force them into the same room. And when that happens, there will be no hiding behind carefully worded statements, no palace silence, no distant geography, just two brothers standing face to face after years of pain. And if that moment finally comes, the world will want to know one thing. Will William finally forgive Harry? Or will Charles's decision to reopen the door to his youngest son create an even bigger divide at the heart of the monarchy? Because the next chapter may not be about Harry returning to the royal family. It may be about whether the royal family can survive his return without breaking apart again. But there is one question that keeps getting louder as this story develops. What exactly does King Charles want from his relationship with Harry? Because if this were simply a private father and son reunion, there would be little reason for the royal world to pay such close attention. But the timing is what makes it so significant. After years of separation, Charles finally welcomed Harry, Meghan, Archie, and Lilibet to Highgrove in July. The meeting was particularly meaningful because Charles had not seen Archie and Lilibet in person for years. And now, reports are suggesting that Harry is determined not to damage that relationship. One recent report described Harry as determined to reconcile with his family and unwilling to do anything that could jeopardize the progress he has made with his father. Think about what that means. For years, Harry's relationship with the royal family was defined by confrontation. Now, the language surrounding him is increasingly about reconciliation. That doesn't mean everything has been forgiven. It doesn't mean the brothers are suddenly close. And it certainly doesn't mean Harry is returning as a working royal. In fact, one of the clearest signs that the situation remains complicated is that reports still describe William and Harry as having no contact, even after Charles's reunion with Harry. So Charles has managed to reopen one door, but another door remains firmly shut. And that is the emotional heart of this entire story, because William isn't simply refusing to speak to a brother. He is dealing with years of hurt, distrust, and public family conflict. And Charles may now be discovering that repairing his relationship with Harry does not automatically repair the relationship between his two sons. In fact, it could make the contrast even more obvious. Charles and Harry meet. William and Harry remain apart. Charles wants more time with his son and grandchildren. William and Kate reportedly remain deeply uncomfortable with the situation. A recent report claimed the couple held serious discussions after Charles's meeting with the Sussexes, although those claims come from royal reporting and unnamed sources rather than an official statement from Kensington Palace. And that distinction is important because the public sees photographs, the public sees headlines, but the private conversations inside the family remain private, which means nobody outside that inner circle can say with certainty what William or Kate actually feel. Still, the reports raise a fascinating possibility. What if William doesn't have to forgive Harry right now? What if Charles has finally realized that reconciliation cannot be forced? Perhaps the king understands something that only time can teach. You cannot order two brothers to forgive each other. You cannot schedule trust. And you cannot erase years of pain with one family meeting. Sometimes the only thing a parent can do is keep one door open, and maybe that's what Charles is doing. He is keeping the door open for Harry, not necessarily asking William to walk through it, not necessarily demanding that Kate accept it, just refusing to close it again. That would explain why this situation feels so different from the royal family's previous attempts to deal with Harry. This time, there seems to be less emphasis on winning, less emphasis on proving who was right, and more emphasis on family, especially the grandchildren, because Archie and Lilibet changed the emotional equation. Whatever happened between the adults, Charles is still their grandfather, and every year that passes is a year he cannot get back. That may be the strongest reason for Charles to continue reaching out. But now comes the moment that could determine everything. Harry's future visits to Britain will put this new relationship to the test. If Harry continues coming back, eventually the chances of him crossing paths with William increase. And when that happens, there will be no escaping the question. Will the brothers finally speak? Or will they pass each other in the same way they have before, separated not by distance, but by everything that happened between them? That moment could become one of the most emotionally charged encounters in the modern royal family's history. Because imagine the scene. Charles has chosen reconciliation. Harry has chosen to keep the door open. William has remained cautious. And suddenly, all three are standing in the same room. No interview, no memoir, no headlines, just a father and his two sons. And perhaps that is why the silence surrounding William and Harry feels so powerful, because sometimes what isn't said tells the story better than anything else. The royal family has survived scandals, divorces, public controversies, and enormous changes. But this is different. This is personal. And for King Charles, time may now be the most important factor of all. He cannot control what William feels. He cannot force Harry to undo the past. He cannot make the public forget years of royal drama. But he can decide what kind of relationship he wants with his son from this point forward. And right now, every sign suggests that Charles wants that door to remain open. The question is whether William will eventually decide to open his own. Because if he does, this entire story changes. Harry's return would no longer simply be about Charles. It would become the beginning of something much bigger. A possible reunion between two brothers who once seemed inseparable. And if that day ever comes, the world won't just be watching the future king and the Duke of Sussex. It will be watching a family finally decide whether forgiveness is stronger than the pain that kept them apart. And that may be the real story behind King Charles's latest move. Not that he has chosen Harry over William, but that, perhaps for the first time in years, he is choosing to leave room for both sons. The only question now is whether they will choose each other. And now we reach the part of this story that could determine where the royal family goes from here. Because Harry's reconciliation with King Charles is no longer just a story about something that happened in the past. It is becoming a question about what happens next. Recent reporting says Harry appears determined to protect the progress he has made with his father and wants to continue rebuilding the relationship with the wider royal family. Sources cited in that reporting say he does not want to jeopardize the renewed connection. That is a remarkable change from the atmosphere surrounding Harry just a few years ago. Back then, every new development seemed to create another layer of tension. Now, Harry appears to be approaching the situation much more carefully, and perhaps he has realized something. You cannot rebuild a family relationship by constantly reopening old wounds. You cannot demand trust. You cannot force forgiveness. And you certainly cannot erase years of conflict overnight. So this time, Harry's strategy appears to be patience. One meeting, then another, one conversation, then perhaps another. And most importantly, keeping the door open. That may explain why the July meeting with Charles was so important. It wasn't a dramatic public reconciliation. There was no grand announcement, no royal balcony appearance, no carefully staged photograph of Charles standing beside Harry. Instead, it was private, and that privacy may actually be the most significant part of the story. Because a family trying to rebuild trust does not necessarily need an audience, it needs space. Charles may understand that. Harry may understand it too. But there is still one relationship that remains unresolved, William and Harry. And that is the relationship that could ultimately determine whether this reconciliation becomes something permanent. Recent reports continue to suggest that the brothers remain deeply estranged even as Harry's relationship with Charles improves. That creates an extraordinary situation. The king can forgive his son. Harry can try to rebuild trust with his father, but William does not have to move at the same speed. And perhaps that is the reality everyone around them now has to accept. William has his own memories, his own grievances, his own responsibilities. And unlike Charles, he isn't simply trying to reconnect with a son. He is also preparing to become king. Every family decision is therefore connected to a much larger institution. That is why reports of tension between Charles and William have attracted so much attention. Some royal commentators believe Charles's renewed relationship with Harry could create friction with his eldest son, while other experts argue that a stronger father-son relationship with Harry could ultimately benefit the monarchy. Two completely different interpretations, and both are possible. Maybe William sees Charles's decision as a threat, or maybe eventually he will see it differently. Maybe he will realize that his father isn't choosing Harry instead of him. Maybe Charles is simply trying to make sure he doesn't lose another year with his youngest son, and that distinction could be everything, because the title of this story asks whether Charles has chosen Harry. But perhaps the deeper question is this. Does a father have to choose between his children at all? Charles may be trying to prove that he doesn't. He can love William. He can love Harry. He can support the future king while still maintaining a relationship with his younger son. The problem is that royal families don't live in a normal world. Every personal decision becomes public. Every meeting becomes a headline. Every absence becomes speculation. And every photograph becomes evidence for one side or another. That's why Harry's expected return to Britain later this year could become so important. Another visit means another opportunity for Harry and Charles to meet. It also creates another possibility of Harry crossing paths with William. And that is the moment everyone will be watching. Because if Charles has truly opened the door, eventually Harry will have to decide how far he wants to walk through it. Does he want only a relationship with his father? Does he want his children to know their grandfather? Or does he secretly hope that one day the relationship with William can be repaired too? Nobody outside the family can answer that with certainty. But one thing is clear. Harry's current approach appears very different from the years when the family conflict played out publicly, and perhaps that is exactly what Charles needed to see. Not perfection, not a complete apology, not an immediate return to royal life, just a willingness to rebuild, slowly, privately, one step at a time. But there is still a painful reality. Even if Charles and Harry become close again, William may remain distant. And if that happens, the royal family could find itself with a strange new balance. A king who has reconciled with his younger son, an heir who remains cautious, a brother who still isn't ready to forgive, and grandchildren who are once again becoming part of their grandfather's life. That isn't a complete happy ending, but perhaps it is the beginning of one. Because reconciliation rarely happens in one dramatic moment. Sometimes it begins with something much smaller, a private meeting, a quiet conversation, a decision not to walk away. And perhaps that is what Charles has chosen. Not Harry over William, not Harry over the monarchy, but family over the possibility that the distance could become permanent. And now the biggest question belongs to William. If his father can reopen the door, if Harry can walk through it without creating another public battle, and if time continues to soften the anger, could William eventually decide to take one step toward his brother? That moment, if it ever comes, could change the entire story. Because after years of separation, the most powerful royal photograph may not be Harry standing beside the king. It may be Harry standing beside William, brothers who once seemed inseparable, two men who went through years of extraordinary pain, and one decision that neither of them can make for the other, whether to finally let the past go. For now, the door is open. Charles has made his move. Harry appears determined not to waste the opportunity. William remains the great unknown, and that is why this royal drama is far from over. And perhaps this is where the entire story comes down to one simple question. Can a family move forward without pretending the past never happened? Because that is what makes King Charles's renewed relationship with Harry so emotional. The July meeting at Highgrove was not a public royal spectacle. It was a private family moment, with Charles spending time with Harry, Meghan, Archie, and Lilibet after years of distance. And according to recent reporting, Harry now appears determined to protect that progress rather than jeopardize it. That doesn't mean everything has suddenly been forgiven. It doesn't mean Harry is returning as a working royal. And it certainly doesn't mean William and Harry have repaired their relationship. In fact, current reporting continues to describe the brothers as deeply estranged, but something has changed. For the first time in years, there appears to be a genuine possibility that Charles and Harry can build a relationship based less on what happened before and more on what happens next. And perhaps that is why the William question matters so much, because William doesn't have to choose between loving his brother and protecting the monarchy. Harry doesn't have to return to royal life to be Charles's son. And Charles doesn't have to abandon William simply because he has decided to reconnect with Harry. Maybe the real answer has never been about choosing one son over the other. Maybe it has always been about refusing to lose either of them. That is a much more complicated story than the headline, and it is also a much more human one. Because behind the titles, behind Buckingham Palace, behind the cameras and endless royal speculation, there is still a father who has lost years with his son and grandchildren. There is still a brother who has been hurt. There is still another brother who appears to want his family back. And there is still time, although nobody knows how much, to change what happens next. Recent reports even suggest that Harry's future UK visits could provide further opportunities for contact with his father. But whether that eventually leads to a meeting with William remains uncertain. And that is the unanswered question hanging over the royal family. Will Charles's decision to reopen the door to Harry eventually become the bridge that brings the brothers closer? Or will it simply create two separate relationships, Charles and Harry on one side, William and Harry still divided on the other? Nobody outside that family can know for certain. But one thing is clear, the door is no longer completely closed. And sometimes, in a family that has been divided for this long, opening the door is the hardest step of all. Perhaps Harry understands that now. Perhaps Charles understands it too. And perhaps William will eventually have to decide what he wants his relationship with his brother to look like for the rest of their lives. Because one day, Charles will no longer be there to stand between them. One day, William will be king. And when that day comes, the question won't be what Charles chose. It will be what William chooses. Forgiveness? Distance? Or one final attempt to rebuild something that was once impossible to break? For now, there is no confirmed royal reconciliation between William and Harry. But there is movement. There is contact between Charles and Harry. There is renewed hope surrounding the family. And there is a story that is clearly not finished. So maybe the headline should not be King Charles chooses Harry. Maybe the real headline is King Charles chooses to leave the door open. And now the future of that family may depend on who is willing to walk through it next. Because sometimes reconciliation doesn't begin with an apology. Sometimes it begins with a simple decision. I'm not closing the door anymore. And for a royal family that has spent years divided by silence, that decision could be more powerful than any public statement. The question now is whether Harry, William, and Charles can turn that small opening into something lasting. Because if they can, this may eventually be remembered not as the story of a royal family falling apart, but as the story of one family finally finding its way back to each other.